All right, hi. I'm coming to you from a different location, not my office. It's a very secret, generic location, to bring you this final lecture for the semester. And as you've noticed from the posting on Blackboard, I'm doing this lecture a little bit differently. I'm not doing it through the Panopto system. I'm going to try a combination of a YouTube video, this, and you running the PowerPoint on your computer. So if you haven't already right now, go ahead and download the PowerPoint from Blackboard, pause me, download the PowerPoint from Blackboard, and open it up, and then start that slideshow on your computer. So in one window, you're going to have your browser, your web browser with my face and YouTube, and another window, you'll have the PowerPoint. And that's what I've got here on my computer as well as I'm taking you through this. And once you've got that done, go ahead and bring me back, pick up the video right here, and I'll start in with the lecture. And I've triggered and timed this so that every time you hear this magical sound, it means you should advance the slide and the next little bit will appear on the PowerPoint lecture. Again, this is just something a little different than the Panopto lecture. It's a different way of delivering basically the same product, and we'll talk about this a little bit in class on Wednesday. So let's get started with the actual lecture. Today we are talking about Japanese theater. And in preparation for reading Love Suicides at Sonozaki, we need to sort of reorient our thinking in terms of both religious and philosophical context. Basically, the way that the Japanese in particular and Eastern cultures in general look at the world. So I'm going to talk about this sort of artificial division between Eastern and Western philosophy. And when we talk about the East, this is based on a worldview that sees Europe as the center of the world, which is not correct, but historically that's how these terms came about. So Europe is the Western world. Europe and America really are the Western world. And then if you put yourself in Europe and go east, you eventually get to Asia, right? So generally speaking, Eastern philosophy refers to India, the Asian Pacific Rim, and most notably China and Japan. So those are the worlds we're living in here today, right? So Western philosophy, right? America and Europe. There are generally different ways of looking at the world and telling stories than there are in the East. And those stories tend to revolve around the basic idea of when we look for stories in the West, in Europe and America, we look for action, we look for motion, we look for change, right? If you think about all the plays we've read this semester, they're very action-oriented. People move forward, they attempt to pursue and solve problems, and typically by the end, there is some level of change or discovery or revelation that people have gone through. Again, very action-driven. I think Oedipus is probably the best example of this. The way in which he learns things and pursues an answer and finds that answer, and at the end of the play we have enormous change. That kind of storyline is very common for just about every sort of Western-oriented story. Now, when we deal with the East, it's a slightly different way of looking at the world. Japan, China, sometimes India, Asian Pacific Rim, North and South Korea. Historically, these cultures have been rooted in a different philosophical way of looking at the world, and that shows itself in a lot of the different kinds of poetry, painting, novels, and plays that those cultures put on. Generally speaking, art in the East tends to focus more on insight, more on looking into and examining yourself, and more on stasis, that is, in sort of being still in the moment and understanding the universe, rather than in that Western context, rushing out to change and find and discover and understand the universe from a proactive standpoint. There's much more about an acceptance of the way the world is in the East, rather than a proactive attempt to change it. Now, massive broad generalizations here that are not fair. I'm talking about thousands of years of history and numerous different countries and cultures. Nonetheless, when we look at Eastern versus Western modes of thinking, these distinctions tend to be a big difference, and you'll see some of that in Love Suicides, a play that unfolds in a very different way than we might expect it to. So let's talk about some specific details here. One of the major philosophical or religious ideas that informs Japan in particular, which is where your play is from, is Zen Buddhism. We know about Buddhism generally, right? But the specific elements of Zen Buddhism are kind of a subset that we need to really understand a little bit better in order to understand the world of Love Suicides at Sonozaki. So Zen Buddhism as a religion depends on a couple of different things. The search for enlightenment. Your job as a Zen Buddhist is to seek out this primary goal of a place that is sort of an enlightened soul, an enlightened being. Enlightenment is very vaguely defined. It's more like a state of mind, right? In the Western or Christian sense, the search is for a way to get to heaven. And heaven tends to be a little bit more concrete. In Zen Buddhism, enlightenment is a much more vague concept. It's a knowing, a oneness, an understanding of the broad universe. It's a very different kind of thing. So as a Zen Buddhist, your primary goal is to search for enlightenment. There is no promise in Zen Buddhism that you will ever actually reach it. Again, you see the idea here of the Eastern philosophy. Insight, stasis, and acceptance. Zen Buddhism is very internal, very considering of self and looking inwards. And there is no promise of an end goal in Zen Buddhism. The process is as important as the product. The other key to Zen Buddhism is that you must detach yourself from worldly pleasures and possessions. And the sort of extreme example of this is the Buddhist monk who lives a very, very minimalist life with no personal possessions, very little, very little other than clothing and the basic needs. The Zen Buddhist mindset argues that it is worldly pleasures, the pursuit of love, the pursuit of gratification, and everything else, and worldly possessions, the desire to own stuff. Those things make us unhappy, say the Zen Buddhists. They prevent us from reaching enlightenment. So we must therefore detach ourselves. So when you look at, when you read Love Suicides for Wednesday, think about the way in which you see characters choosing or not choosing to seek enlightenment and choosing or not choosing to detach from worldly pleasures and possessions. So we have Zen Buddhism, and we also have another important religion in the Japanese culture, which is Shintoism. And Shinto is basically this idea that your job as a human is to pay homage to or worship this large natural force called the kami. And kami is, again, kind of vaguely defined, but there are basically huge natural forces at work in the world. And what the result of kami worship is the discovery of divinity in anything amazing. And this seems like kind of an obscure concept, but pause for a second and think about the Greek gods. The Greeks, which are a very Western mindset, right, found divinity in everything amazing. They looked at all the natural wonders of the world, right? The sun is Apollo. Lightning, we associate that with Zeus, and et cetera, et cetera. You look at every single Greek god, and it's a natural phenomenon taken into human god form and made amazing. The kami worship in Shintoism is exactly the same thing. There are all sorts of different little gods. They're usually nature worship, or they're usually nature oriented in Japan, and they're all sorts of little Shinto shrines set up all over the place. The point is that historically, from a long, long time ago, believers in Shinto looked at the natural world and found supernatural powers in it, and that's where Shintoism comes from. So we have these philosophical differences. We've got Zen Buddhism and Shintoism that really inform a lot of what's going on in Japan historically, and in particular in Love Suicides. So we've got that. Let's move on and talk about the conventions of Japanese theater. The first one we need to talk about, and this is another important disconnect from the way we do things in the West. Japanese theater has massive, deep roots in tradition. In the West, in Europe and America, we tend to think of theater as being something that we would bring our own original contribution to, right? A lot of the reason you are actors and directors and designers is because you want to bring a new idea to the theater. You want to show us something we've never seen before. In Japan, in many of the theater arts, it's exactly the opposite. What you want to do as an actor in Japan is perform and execute the role exactly the way it's been executed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Innovation, at least in the traditional forms of Japanese theater, there are some newer forms of Japanese theater that are very creative oriented, right? But in the traditional forms of Japanese theater, your job is to maintain and respect the tradition. And we'll talk about this later when you get to pre-modern theater history, but there is a form of Japanese theater called No theater, N-O-H, that has been performed basically the same way for almost 600 years. So every time you go see a show in a No theater, You are seeing exactly the same gestures, movements, inflections, everything, the same way it was done 600 years ago, the first time it was done. That, in any event, is the idea. Obviously, there have been some changes, but Bunraku, puppet theater, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is another great example of this interest in finding a maintenance of tradition. We are not interested in this era in doing new or creative or unusual things. There are some exceptions to that rule, but by and large, in the Japanese theater, your primary job is to maintain and respect the previous tradition. So again, you can see a very different mindset in Eastern theater than what we tend to expect in the West. Another contrast, although for this semester it seems pretty familiar, Japanese theater is consistently, fundamentally presentational and stylized. Japanese theater does not intend to realistically represent the world. It relies very heavily on all sorts of traditions that are very, very stylized. For example, and you'll see this in the Bunraku video you're going to watch in a second, but you'll also see it in many other theater forms. A lot of times when a character in Japanese theater is speaking, the actor playing that character is not the person doing the speaking. The speaking is done from off stage by a narrator. We can usually see the narrator. Again, when you see the Bunraku video, you'll understand what I'm talking about. There's no attempt to create any kind of realistic theater. Your job is to find different stylized, non-realistic ways to create the world of the play. And we've talked a lot about presentationalism and stylization and non-realistic choices a lot this semester, and you're going to see some of that. And actually, ironically, of the traditional Japanese theater forms, Bunraku is the most realistic, and it's the one that has puppets. The other traditional Japanese theater forms have actual live acting people. Bunraku's got puppets, but it's the most realistic theater form, which is very unusual. Even so, Bunraku is very presentational, very stylized. Well, you'll see when you see the video. For example, the Western theater equivalent of puppet theater that you most often think of is obviously the Muppets, right? The big deal about the Muppets and most puppetry in this country is that you never see the puppeteers. That's part of the, it almost makes it realistic, right? In Japanese Bunraku theater, you can see the puppeteers and you can see the narrator. We're not trying to hide the mechanics of the theater. So again, presentational, stylized. Performance is much more important than the text. Whereas, well, let's say with Hamlet, right, Shakespeare writes a very, very, very long play, and text analysis is really useful, and it's a text-based way of telling a story. In Japanese theater, the emphasis is much more on the visual spectacle and the execution of performance. It's not that text isn't important. Certainly it is. That's why we're reading this play. But text is much less substantial, and performance and execution is much more important. There is, generally speaking, in Japanese theater, a different handling of change and conflict. In the Western theater, we tend to expect, again, it's like I said earlier in the philosophy slide, we tend to expect in the West that people will seek out and try to understand and solve problems and grow and change and learn. The handling of change and conflict in Japanese theater and Eastern theater in general is much more about learning to come to terms with the way the world is and being at peace with that and finding a way to accept it, which is really a mentality that really, we kind of tend to rebel against a little bit. Not always, but a little bit, right? So again, I just want to keep emphasizing these different conventions that really create theater that is very different from what we tend to expect in the West. The specific kind of theater we're dealing with here is Bunraku. And this is puppet theater, like I've said before. And you'll see this in the video. The puppets have really fascinating, specific life detail, both in terms of design and in terms of the way the puppeteers handle them to almost act like real people, right? Like I said before, the puppeteers are visible. You can see them. There's no attempt to hide them, but they're silent. All the text of the performance is read by a narrator who is off to the side of the stage. And that's, again, another unusual but expected convention. There we are, the music and the narrator. And the musical accompaniment is another important thing that you will hear when you see the video coming up here in a second. Eastern music is based on a different scale and tends to be very well, foreign to our Western ears. So keep an eye out to the way in which, keep an ear out to the way in which music is used to enhance and help tell the story. And you will also see this with Bunraku Theater. The scenery is elaborate, in some cases kind of shockingly beautiful, and there are multiple shifts to indicate different locations. So despite the fact we're dealing with puppets, and despite the fact we're dealing with very presentational stylized theater, there are still a few elements that are kind of realistic. The elaborate scenery is usually realistic. Now, you'll see this when you see the video. It's realistic in a kind of stylized manner, and we'll talk about that in class and kind of get the way in which the visuals work, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. So here is a quick little shot of the way in which puppeteers work in Bunraku, and you can see just from this tiny little image here that we've got a very stylized, unusual form of puppetry, no attempt to hide the puppeteers, but as you can see in the video, hold on a sec, there is a lot of realism in the actual execution. So what I want you to do now is pause me, click the link that is sitting on the side of this slide, and you will open up a YouTube video, about 5 minutes, that'll take you through some of the styles, the history, and have a lot of really good clips from Bunraku Theater. When you're done with that, pause that and come back to me because we've got one more slide. Also, by the way, if you click on that link for the video and it doesn't open, go back to the Blackboard site where you downloaded or where you accessed this video, and you'll find another link that gives you a direct link to that YouTube video. Either way, pause me for a second, go watch this video, then come back to me right here. All right, welcome back. And our last slide is just simply the one I try to always do, which is, here are some things to think about as you read Love Suicides at Sonozaki. First off, we always want to be thinking about how this play is different than plays we've read so far, period, but in particular, how is this play different from the Western plays we've read so far this semester? Specific things to think about. How does Chikamatsu handle the importance of the different poetics elements? We've talked about that for each of the different plays, and I think we have kind of a very new and different arrangement here with Love Suicides, and I want you to sort of consider that. Also think about that thing that I mentioned earlier in the lecture, the use of the performance over the text. Performance is more important than text here. In a lot of the other plays we've read this semester, the text is really heavy and substantial and in-depth, and it's not that the performance isn't important, but text is really, really important in a lot of our other plays. For this play, performance is significantly more important. Tell me how you can sort of tell that as you read the play. And then, where do you see those Japanese religious and philosophical contexts expressed? Is this a play that has Zen Buddhist ideology in it? Is this a play that has Shintoist ideology in it? And generally speaking, again, how is this play representative of an Eastern mindset, which is kind of different from what we tend to think of? So that's your lecture, and go ahead and enjoy reading the play, and I will see you in our next class.